There are moments in life when the sky doesn't split open, thunder doesn't roll, and no glasses shatter. But something irreversible happens anyway. This was one of those moments. It started, as it often did, with Malcolm's voice echoing down the hallway like a bad sermon. "You gave away the clock? My grandmother's clock? Without even asking me?" I was in the study, alphabetizing my poetry anthologies. Again, I find order soothing when the world insists on being ridiculous. "It wasn't even working," I replied, without turning around. "And besides, I thought the shelter could use something that ticks without judgment." He stormed into the doorway, all flushed cheeks and inflated entitlement. That clock was an heirloom. I closed the book in my hand, frost, ironically, and looked up. Then it's had practice surviving cold things. That was when he did it. Not the shouting. I've outlasted both tenure committees and preteen Shakespeare students. No, it was what he said next that cinched it. "If you don't like how things are around here, leave. Not like you've got anywhere else to go." There it was, neatly delivered. The kind of sentence that doesn't just burn the bridge. It rewrites the map. He stood there, arms crossed, smug in that familiar way. The expression of a man who believes his bank account is a personality. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. I just tilted my head slightly, studying him the way one might study a crooked painting, with the faint itch that something is deeply off. And then I nodded. No dramatics, no slammed doors or broken dishes, just a soft internal click, the sound of a lock turning for the last time. He always thought the house was the crown. I was the kingdom. I made tea that evening. Chamomile. I offered him a cup, and he refused, still sulking in the living room like a king banished from his own court. He thought I was retreating. I wasn't. I was observing, because that's the thing about women like me. We don't raise our voices. We raise consequences. While he watched TV, something with too much noise and too little nuance, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I began a list. Not of grievances, not yet, just things that mattered. Passport, pension documents, the original deed paperwork. He never noticed when I filed it for him. The small carved jewelry box from my mother, and my annotated copy of Jane Eyre, of course. Survival literature for women misunderstood by men who believe possession equals loyalty. Malcolm called out something from the living room, a snide remark about women and their emotions. I didn't respond. He wouldn't have understood the reference anyway. By the time I got to bed, he was already asleep, snoring in that triumphant way men do when they think they've won something. I stood there for a moment, watching him with the dispassion of someone inspecting the final chapter of a book she no longer wants to finish. Then I turned off the light. The next morning I made breakfast, a habit, not a gesture. I poured his coffee, placed his toast on the edge of the plate the way he liked, then sat across the table with my own. He didn't say thank you. He never did. And I realized then, he didn't think I could leave. Not really. He believed the years had worn me down into something soft and shapeless, that the walls of this house were stronger than the spine I used to stand at lecterns and challenge centuries of literary male mediocrity. But what he forgot was that while he paid for the roof, I built the home. And I was done living in a place where silence was cheaper than kindness. He bit into his toast. I folded my napkin, and quietly, without ceremony, I began my exit. You don't wake up one morning erased. It happens gradually. Like a chalkboard that's been wiped so many times the residue becomes the background. At first, it was small things. Malcolm insisted we use his accountant because he knows how I like things done. I didn't argue. Why would I? Numbers were never my passion, and I was still grading final essays at the time, dissecting Dickinson and coaxing seniors through passive voice. I assumed marriage was about division of labor, not division of power. Then came the house. We bought it. He bought it, shortly after we married. I contributed what I could from the sale of my late father's books and a modest teaching bonus. But the paperwork, the title, the mortgage, all in Malcolm's name. When I asked, he waved me off. You don't need the hassle, Evie. Just let me handle it. I let him. I let him handle so much. And over time, I noticed I had stopped asking for things and started checking in. A subtle shift, like a comma sliding into a sentence where a period once stood. The kitchen became my domain, not because I loved cooking, but because it was one of the few rooms where no one argued with me. I made risotto from scratch, ironed his shirts with military precision, and managed a household schedule so efficiently I could have run a minor nation. And still, I was somehow never consulted, only assigned. The stepchildren arrived every other weekend in the beginning. Harper, with her faintly judgmental perfume and inherited superiority. Dean, the quieter one, who could barely remember my name if it wasn't attached to a request for something. At best, they treated me like hotel staff. At worst, like antique furniture, necessary, but never to be touched too personally. Once at a family dinner, Harper brought her fiancé. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal. When someone complimented the roast, she smiled and said, "Yes, Dad always liked to eat well," as if the roast had magically appeared because her father had high standards. I laughed, out loud. I couldn't help it. She blinked, confused. "Did I say something funny?" she asked. I sipped my wine and replied, "Only if you enjoy fiction with unreliable narrators." Malcolm didn't say a word. He rarely did when it came to his children. I was a convenience, a solution to his loneliness, not someone worth defending. I was Evie when he needed something, and your stepmother when he didn't. Our finances were equally partitioned, which is to say, they weren't. I kept my checking account for groceries, holiday gifts, and the occasional cardigan. His income was the real income, the kind that bought cars and made investment decisions. He once joked, "Well, I did marry a literature professor, not a stockbroker." I smiled and said, "And yet here I am, enriching your portfolio of excuses." He didn't catch the insult. He rarely did. And the thank yous? They came like performance reviews, sparingly and with conditions. "Thanks for handling dinner tonight, Evie." Translation: because I didn't feel like calling for takeout. "Thanks for picking up my prescription." Translation: I forgot to do it 3 days in a row. You're such a help. Translation: you're expected, not appreciated. I wasn't unloved, not in the traditional sense. I was simply undervalued, like an out-of-print book with a cracked spine, too familiar to be exciting, too useful to be discarded. But literature teaches you to pay attention to motifs, recurring patterns, symbols that scream the truth while everyone else mumbles. And the motif of my marriage? Silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that fills a room when someone chooses not to be curious about your inner life. The kind that grows when you stop saying what you need because the reply will be, "We'll see," or worse, "Why do you always make things complicated?" I didn't always know I was being erased, but I knew I was being edited. And the thing about women like me, eventually we stop accepting red pens. We pick up the damn typewriter. There's something oddly cinematic about the way fate tiptoes in, not with fanfare, but with the unassuming buzz of a cell phone on a cluttered windowsill. I had just finished wiping down the dining table, out of habit, not purpose. Malcolm had gone out for one of his charity golf tournaments, the kind where middle-aged men wear too much beige and raise money for causes they can't pronounce. I found the silence delightful, the table spotless, the air still. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something, call it curiosity or boredom dressed up in intuition, nudged my hand forward. "Evelyn Calder," I answered, as I always had. I never got into the habit of hello. Literature teaches you that clarity at the start saves confusion in the middle. There was a pause, then a bright voice, slightly breathless. "Professor Calder? It's Nina Keene, from your Women in Literature seminar, 7 years ago?" I blinked, and in my mind she reappeared. Nina, with her oversized glasses, annotated post-its sticking out of her Norton anthology like a fan of defiance. "Well," I said, settling into the chair, "if this is about a late paper, I regret to inform you the statute of limitations has expired." She laughed. that same breathy chuckle full of nerves and ambition. No, nothing academic. I saw your name on a shared alumni post. And when I read it, I thought, that woman changed the way I think about everything. And then I realized, maybe now it's my turn. My eyebrows lifted. That's quite the opening line. I became a lawyer, she continued. Family law, asset protection. I remember everything you taught me about agency and authorship and not letting anyone else write your ending. I thought maybe I could help. Ah, I murmured. The student becomes the attorney. Poetic. She was quiet for a second. Then her voice lowered, not dramatically, but with that intuitive cadence women learn when they're about to say something careful. Forgive me if I'm overstepping, Professor, but I did some research. Your name isn't on the deed to the house, is it? I exhaled slowly, like someone who just heard a diagnosis she'd already suspected. No, Nina, it isn't. And your husband, Malcolm, I cut in, has strong opinions, weak coffee, and no concept of equitable division. But yes, he's still very much present. I'd like to offer you a consultation, free of charge. I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. Is this how all your clients come in? A cold call and a warm memory? Just the ones who once taught me that Jane Eyre walked away with nothing but her dignity. And that was more than enough. I let that sit, for a long moment, because there it was, the mirror I hadn't looked into for years. A young woman reminding me that I once taught people how to walk away from what diminished them. And I'd been sitting in a house pretending the walls were shelter, when really they were scaffolding around a version of myself I'd long stopped updating. All right, Nina, I said at last, standing up and walking toward the window. The garden below looked smaller than I remembered, like the world had shrunk around me while I was busy keeping things running. Send me your office address, I said. And Nina? Yes? Thank you for remembering. Most people don't. She replied softly, You were unforgettable. I hung up the phone and placed it face down on the windowsill. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt preparatory. She remembered my lectures. Now it was time I remembered who I used to be before I traded my voice for shared dinner plans and polite dismissals. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen, and for the first time in a very long time, I poured tea not because someone else wanted it, but because I did. There's a particular kind of dignity in preparation, not the frantic kind, born of panic, but the deliberate sort, quiet, systematic, and laced with intent. It's how I used to grade final essays. Red pen poised, kettle on the boil, one eyebrow raised. And now, it's how I began to pack my life into a carryable size, not because I was running, because I was editing. The first item I reached for was not a suitcase, but a pen, ballpoint, cheap, but it had bite. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook, the same one Malcolm had once dismissed as your little scribble book. He thought I was journaling. I wasn't. I was recording. And darling, I've always been a meticulous archivist. I made a checklist, not of clothing or toiletries, but of proof, not for anyone else, for me. Birth certificate, passport, pension files, faculty commendation letter from the university. The final lecture notes from my literature and liberation seminar, my mother's letters, tied with lavender thread, tucked in an old envelope labeled, Read When the World Forgets Your Name. I packed slowly, precisely. I left behind every piece of Malcolm's curated taste, the art he never understood, the leather armchairs that matched his sense of self-importance, the wine fridge stocked with bottles he only drank when guests came over to validate his charm. I took nothing he'd bought me, on principle, especially not the pearl necklace he gave me on our 10th anniversary with the line, It's classic, like you, simple, understated. Yes, because every woman dreams of being described like a salad dressing. What I did take, however, was one thing he never knew was mine to begin with. A small antique box carved in rosewood tucked at the back of the armoire. He always thought it was decorative. It wasn't. It contained the will my father had written by hand. A lock of my mother's hair, cut just before her chemotherapy began. And a faded Polaroid of me at 21, standing on the courthouse steps after my first protest, holding a sign that read, "Silence is a decision." I lifted the box and held it for a long moment. It's strange how something so small can hold everything a house never did. The dog, Henry, followed me from room to room while I sorted. Malcolm called him the mutt and insisted we didn't need a pet. But Henry had other plans. He always curled at my feet like a quiet vote of confidence. "You're coming with me," I told him softly. "I've got tenure in your heart after all." When I reached the bedroom, I opened my side of the closet. My clothes, as expected, were pressed and aligned. Malcolm always joked that I folded things like I was applying to live in them. I packed 3 dresses, 2 cardigans, comfortable shoes, a nightgown with no lace. The rest I left, neatly, respectfully, as if to say, "I didn't take what was yours, I just stopped offering what was mine." By the time I zipped the suitcase, the light outside had shifted. Late afternoon, the kind of golden hour that flatters even tired curtains and women with thinning patience. Malcolm still hadn't returned, likely sipping bourbon with men who mistake ambition for identity. The house was quiet, but not warm. Not anymore. Before I left, I took one final lap, checking each room not for belongings but for emotion. I found none. Just echoes. Empty praise, forgotten birthdays, clipped conversations over reheated pasta. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. Instead, I left a single note on the kitchen counter, folded, centered, written in my neatest hand. "If you're wondering where I went, I took the pieces you never noticed were mine. That includes the dog." And with that, I picked up my bag, my box, and my spine, still perfectly intact, and walked out the front door. No one stopped me, not even the wind. Because sometimes freedom doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a checklist and silence that finally belongs to you. There's a moment, right between decision and action, where everything holds its breath. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. That morning, the house felt like it was watching me. The walls, the furniture, the doormat with its faded welcome, all quietly wondering if I meant it this time. I did. I boiled the kettle, not because I needed tea, but because leaving a warm pot behind felt poetic. Let him walk in and wonder who drank the last cup of calm before the storm. Henry, ever loyal, sat at the foot of the stairs, tail thumping against the hardwood in his slow, steady rhythm. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just knew. That made one of us. I moved through the rooms methodically, not because I wanted to, but because I believed in exits with clean punctuation. I straightened the throw pillows, watered the plant Malcolm always forgot was real, and wiped down the kitchen counter with the kind of precision that borders on metaphor. He never noticed those small things. He just assumed the house ran on gratitude and domestic air. But it wasn't gratitude. It was discipline. Mine. On the hallway table, I left the note. Folded, handwritten, and signed. "If you're looking for someone to order around, I suggest you hire help. I've got places to be." There was no bitterness in the ink, just finality. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy. What I had was conviction. I stepped outside, suitcase in one hand, Henry's leash in the other. The morning air had that early bite, the kind that reminds you fall is coming whether you're ready or not. Good. I was ready. I paused on the porch for one last glance, not sentimental, archival, like a historian studying ruins before they're swallowed by ivy and silence. The house looked just as it always had, smug and beige, but now it looked smaller, like the illusion had been stripped away and all that was left was drywall and entitlement. I walked down the steps slowly, savoring the sound of my shoes on the concrete, one small footnote at a time. Across the street, Mr. Fellows nodded from his porch swing. I nodded back. He raised his coffee mug and called out, "Heading somewhere, Evelyn?" I smiled faintly. "Just revising a chapter." He chuckled like he didn't quite get it, but appreciated the cadence. That's the thing about metaphors. they're not always for the listener. At the corner, I turned once, not for the house, but for the woman who'd lived inside it, the one who held dinner parties and dental reminders, therapy appointments, and Thanksgiving seating charts, all while quietly deferring her own name on every deed and decision. I wanted to see her one last time, to nod at her too. You did well with what you had, but you don't owe survival your loyalty forever. My niece Sasha's apartment wasn't far, just 2 bus transfers and a walk through a neighborhood that smelled like coffee and possibility. She'd offered to pick me up, but I declined. I needed to carry the weight of this exit on my own. You don't reclaim your life in someone else's passenger seat. When I arrived, Sasha opened the door in pajama pants and a top knot, eyes soft with relief. No judgment, no dramatic hugs. Just a quiet, "You made it." Henry bounded in like he'd just been upgraded to first class. I stepped inside, dropped my bag, and looked around. The walls were bright, the furniture mismatched, the energy honest. "Your place is chaotic," I said. Sasha smirked. "That's the theme." Good. I was never one for order without meaning. We sat down for tea, the kind made in a chipped mug, not a curated pot, and I felt something shift. Not the room, me. I wasn't in hiding. I wasn't in limbo. I was in motion. Malcolm would come home to find my note. He would read it. He would scoff. He would call. He would leave a message, somewhere between demanding and disbelieving. I would not answer, because I wasn't on pause anymore. I wasn't even gone. I was arriving. There is a specific kind of silence in a home that's lived in. Not the oppressive, clock-ticking hush of being ignored, but the open-ended quiet that says, "Speak when you're ready." No one's timing you. Sasha's apartment had that silence. The walls were painted in imperfect brushstrokes, likely a weekend project with too much coffee and not enough tape. There were crayons on the kitchen table, a stack of mismatched mugs by the sink, and a sock, singular, draped ceremoniously over the back of the couch like it had declared asylum. In short, it was chaos. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at ease. Sasha met me at the door with her usual lack of fanfare. Hair in a bun, bare feet, a spoon in one hand, and a toddler on the hip. "Welcome to the land of forgotten chores," she grinned. I stepped inside, set my bag down gently, and replied, "Chores are simply narratives waiting to be reframed." She laughed, already used to my sentences coming dressed in metaphor. Her daughter Imogen, 5, curly-haired and all elbows, peeked out from behind the door and squinted at me. "Your Aunt Evie?" "I am," I said. "And who might you be besides small and suspicious?" Imogen narrowed her eyes, then smiled like she'd just decided I passed an invisible test. She ran off, presumably to begin a secret project. Sasha set the spoon down and poured us tea into mugs that proudly did not match the saucers. I sat across from her, took a sip, and felt my jaw relax. "Your tea tastes like rebellion," she smirked. "It's lemon ginger." Exactly. That night I laughed, not because someone told a joke, not because I was performing hostess charm, but because Sasha tripped on a laundry basket, cursed in 4 languages, and said, "If one more person tells me to try Pilates, I swear I'll punch the sun." It was so deeply honest I couldn't stop the laughter from bubbling out. Sharp and loud and real, the kind that folds your body and shakes something loose. I hadn't heard that sound from myself in months, maybe years. Later, as I was setting up in the guest room, really a futon beside a bookshelf and a lamp that flickered if you looked at it sternly, Imogen came in with a piece of paper clutched in her tiny hand. "I made this," she announced. I took it gently. Crayon on printer paper, 3 stick figures, one with curly hair labeled me, one with wild lashes labeled Mom, and one with glasses, an exaggerated bun, and a bright red cape. Me. "Aunt Evie," she explained, "the lady who fixed everything." I looked down at the drawing. The figure was flying, apparently. Red cape trailing behind like punctuation on a sentence I didn't know I'd written. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought. Or in this case, off the crayons of girls who know what power actually looks like. I cleared my throat. Why a cape? Imogene shrugged. Because you came. People who come get capes. Simple logic. Unassailable. I folded the drawing and placed it in my bag. Not for nostalgia, for documentation. Proof that even after you've been erased, you can be redrawn. Sasha and I sat on the balcony later that evening. The city hummed around us. Sirens in the distance, wind rustling laundry on a neighbor's line, someone playing jazz badly but earnestly. She handed me a glass of wine, the cheap kind that tries too hard. Still, it was cold and generous. Are you going to be okay? She asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared out at the skyline where everything looked slightly imperfect and very alive. I will be, I said finally. Because for once I'm not fixing a life I was never really allowed to live. She nodded. You were always the smart one, she said. I took a sip. Not smart enough to leave earlier. Sasha raised her glass, but wise enough to know when enough is enough. That night, as I lay on the futon under a blanket covered in cartoon dinosaurs, I stared at the ceiling and let my mind wander. Not toward regrets, but toward revisions. What came next wasn't about survival. It was about authorship. The law office was tucked between a vegan bakery and a dog spa. Two things I'd normally avoid, not out of principle but aesthetic. One smelled of sanctimony, the other of wet kale. But Nina's office was on the third floor, and the moment I stepped off the elevator, I knew I was no longer in Malcolm's world. No mahogany, no oversized clocks, no receptionist offering water like it was holy. Just Nina, standing in the doorway of her glass-walled office with a stack of papers in one hand and a smile that said, I've been waiting. Evelyn, she said, ushering me in. I've done some digging. I set my bag down beside the chair, no wheels, thank God, and removed my gloves slowly. Not because I needed the drama, but because timing is still everything. She slid a folder across the table. You taught me metaphor, she said. Now let's turn his bank account into one. I opened it. Malcolm's holdings were predictably uninspired. A few mutual funds, a second property in Maine, which he told me he sold years ago. A brokerage account registered in his name and, because life loves irony, his daughter Harper's. Joint, of course. A precaution, he once said, just in case something happens. Something had, Malcolm. It was called me remembering who I am. Nina tapped a page. Your name isn't on any of this, not even the utilities. I didn't blink. That checks out. He always said the paper trail was too complicated. Was he always this controlling? She asked. I tilted my head. Let's say, he curated his generosity, like one of those art patrons who insists on full credit for someone else's brushwork. She smiled, faintly. You're legally entitled to file for equitable distribution under spousal contribution. I raised an eyebrow. That's a rather romantic term for unpaid domestic labor. She shrugged. The courts are slowly catching up to what women have known since ancient Greece. Good, I said, because I've cleaned enough metaphorical stables to qualify as a myth. We spent the next hour sorting through what Malcolm considered his private empire. Nina asked measured questions, took precise notes, and occasionally tilted her head when she was amused by my phrasing. I detailed the last 30 years like a historian, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just naming. Grocery lists, medical appointments, cleaning schedules, holiday planning. Emotional labor performed while smiling politely at dinner parties that made me feel like a lampshade in pearls. She listened. Not the way Malcolm used to, nodding just enough to maintain plausible interest, but truly listened. You built that house, she said softly. No, I corrected. I built the life inside of it. He built the square footage. She leaned back and smiled like a chess player seeing an opening. I'd like to issue a discovery request. Asset documentation, property evaluations, all under the veil of amicable negotiation, for now. And when he refuses, then we go formal. I folded my hands on the desk. And what exactly does that look like? Nina didn't flinch. A motion for marital asset division, retroactive spousal contribution valuation, and a claim on any property acquired during the marriage, regardless of title. I nodded. Will it be ugly? I asked. She paused carefully. Not if he's smart. I laughed. Well then, we'll need to prepare for ugly. Before I left, she handed me a second folder. Blank. For you, she said. Start writing down anything that matters. Even the small things. Especially the small things. Like the years I kept his mother's birthday on the calendar? She smiled. Exactly. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Below, someone was parallel parking like it was a performance art piece. A cyclist swerved. A pigeon judged everyone. I forgot how invigorating paperwork can be, I murmured. You always said detail was power, Nina replied. And you always paid attention, I said, turning. She nodded. You gave me books. Let me help you keep the spine. And there it was, a sentence that belonged in one of my old lectures, now used to stitch me back into the narrative. I tucked the folder under my arm, pulled on my gloves, and turned toward the door. Let's draft the first letter, I said. Let him open something that doesn't smell like his cologne or control. Because this time, he wouldn't be receiving affection. He'd be receiving notice. And I'd be receiving acknowledgement. In print. There are few pleasures quite like discovering what a man tried to hide, especially when he was so certain you'd never look. Nina had warned me. Once we send the discovery letter, expect resistance, posturing, maybe even denial. She was half right. Malcolm didn't respond to Nina's letter with words. He responded with silence, weaponized, condescending, and wrapped in the assumption that if he ignored it long enough, I'd fold like laundry. I didn't. Instead, Nina filed a formal demand for financial disclosure. And what came back? Well, let's just say that Malcolm had a gift for deception that would have impressed Machiavelli, if Machiavelli had also been petty, smug, and incapable of wiping his own stovetop. The documents arrived in a thick manila envelope. Nina and I met in her office, where she handed me a cup of coffee before sliding the papers across the table like she was dealing a hand of cards neither of us had asked for. I flipped through the pages. Routine at first. Brokerage summaries, investment statements, pension distributions. And then I saw it. A real estate transfer document. A quiet little footnote in the appendix. A 3-bedroom home in coastal Maine, gifted to one Harper W. Hensley. No mention of a transaction amount. Just a clean transfer of title, filed 6 months after my 60th birthday. Nina spoke before I could. He moved the property into his daughter's name. No payment, no legal trust, just handed it over. I stared at the page. The ink wasn't fresh, but my fury was. He always thought inheritance was a blood right, I murmured. He forgot what it means to earn. Nina watched me carefully. Are you all right? I leaned back, a wry smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. Oh, I'm better than all right. I'm finally reading the fine print of my own erasure. Malcolm had mentioned the Maine property only once, over dinner 2 years ago. He said he'd sold it because it needed too many repairs and wasn't worth the taxes. I had nodded, like a woman nods when she knows the truth costs more than the argument. Now I saw the truth in writing. It hadn't been sold. It had been preserved, just not for me. Nina tapped her pen. This is significant. Transferring a marital asset without consent, especially to an adult child, can be viewed as concealment. Depending on the timing and jurisdiction, we may be able to challenge it. Challenge it, I said. Then underline it. And if we're feeling bold, let's annotate it for emphasis. She grinned. You really were a professor, weren't you? I still am, I said. Just teaching a different kind of lesson now. That evening, I returned to Sasha's apartment with a new folder under my arm and an old ache in my chest. Not grief, not rage, something quieter, something like clarity. She was making soup, lentils, with far too much garlic as usual, and Imogene was at the table with her crayons, drawing what appeared to be a dragon holding a library card. Did you find out anything today? Sasha asked. I set the folder down. Oh, a few things. Malcolm is predictably still himself, and his daughter is now the proud owner of a house she didn't pay for. Sasha raised an eyebrow. Wait, The one by the water? The one with the rose bushes? The very same, I said, removing my coat. Apparently shrubbery and betrayal pair nicely. Imogene looked up. What's betrayal? Something that makes grown-ups rewrite their wills, I said. She nodded and went back to her dragon. Later that night, I opened my notebook, the one I now treated less like a journal and more like a case file, and added a new entry. Assets removed without consent. One house, one promise, one illusion of partnership. Followed by assets reclaimed. One voice, one spine, one very sharp attorney. People often say you shouldn't keep score in a marriage, that it's not a competition. They're right. It's not a competition. It's a contract. And if one party breaches the terms, the other is well within her rights to cite the clause, call her lawyer, and walk away with the receipts. Malcolm didn't understand that, but he would. Some men don't knock because they respect the door. They knock because they can't imagine it not opening for them. It was a Thursday, the kind of late afternoon where the sun hovers just long enough to pretend it's still summer, and the world briefly forgets that endings exist. I was folding laundry, Sasha's, not mine. Not out of obligation, but habit. I've always liked the quiet symbolism of matching socks, order, patience, pairs that somehow survive the wash. And then it came. Not the doorbell, the knock. Hard, impatient, self-important. The kind of knock that says, I haven't changed. I've just gotten louder. Sasha poked her head out of the kitchen, her brows already narrowed. Are you expecting anyone? I shook my head. Number. But the past usually arrives unannounced. I walked to the door and opened it slowly. And there he was, Malcolm. In his favorite wool coat, the one with the suede collar and a hint of cologne that had always tried too hard. His face was tight with tension, like a man who hadn't expected to be made to wait and was offended by the concept. Evelyn, he said, with a breathy mixture of indignation and disbelief. So this is where you've run off to. I didn't move. You're at your niece's, he continued. Hiding? Is that what we're calling it? No, I said calmly. We're calling it living, a concept I don't expect you to recognize. His eyes flicked past me, scanning Sasha's apartment as if he were checking for evidence of his own irrelevance. You walk out on a man who gave you everything, he said, voice tightening. I studied him for a beat. Then I smiled. You gave me chores, not choices. I gave you a life. Now I'm taking mine back. His mouth opened slightly, stunned. You can't just rewrite history, he snapped. Darling, I said, I taught history, and unlike you, I have footnotes. Behind me, Sasha stood silently in the hallway, arms crossed. Imogen peeked out from her bedroom wide-eyed. I glanced back just enough to catch Sasha's eye and give her the smallest nod. I've got this. Malcolm stepped forward, lowering his voice like he was still in control of the tone. We were married 30 years. That means something. It means I get to divide the assets, I replied. Not that I owe you eternal silence, he scoffed. You've let some lawyer put poison in your ear. No, I said. What Nina gave me was perspective. The poison came from years of being expected to smile while dying by degrees. He pointed toward the inside of the apartment. This whole setup, you think it's better than what you had? I tilted my head. Let me see. Warmth, autonomy, dinner that doesn't arrive with passive-aggressive remarks about salt? Yes, Malcolm, I think it's a distinct improvement. His voice sharpened. You're humiliating yourself. No, I said softly. You're just not used to me speaking where others can hear. Imogene's small voice broke the moment. Is that the man who forgot Grandma's birthday? There was a pause, and then Sasha burst out laughing. Not cruelly, just freely. Like a valve had opened. I didn't look away from Malcolm. Children have excellent memories, Malcolm. Unlike some men who treat thoughtfulness like an optional upgrade. His posture stiffened. You'll regret this. I met his eyes, clear, steady, unimpressed. Regret isn't what happens when you leave the wrong man, I said. Regret is what happens when you stay long enough for him to believe your silence was agreement. He stood there, caught somewhere between fury and confusion. as if he'd just realized he was no longer the narrator of the story, just a minor character with poor development. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, voice low. "I am," I said. "And you think you're better off?" I smiled, not bitterly, just honestly. "No, Malcolm, I know I am." He stepped back like he'd been hit. For a moment he looked smaller, and I realized he'd always been smaller. I had just been too busy shrinking to match him. He didn't say goodbye. He turned, walked down the steps, pulled his coat tighter, the same coat he'd worn for a decade, as if repetition could substitute for warmth. I closed the door slowly, no slamming, no dramatic sigh, just a click. Final. Clean. Like the end of a chapter that never deserved a sequel. Sasha looked at me. "Want tea?" "No," I said. "I want pie." She blinked. "Any particular kind?" "Something celebratory," I replied. "Preferably with whipped cream and a flaky crust. The kind you serve when you've just evicted a ghost from your hallway." She grinned. And somewhere in the background, Imogene resumed coloring, with red crayon this time. "Make sure Grandma has a cape," she said. "Oh, she does," Sasha whispered. "She just took it off to answer the door." Some wars are fought with lawyers. Others are won with ledgers, lists, and the unshakable calm of a woman who kept the receipts. We met in courtroom 4B, a room that smelled faintly of anxiety and laminate wood. It was simple, unimpressive. The kind of space where lives are quietly rearranged, not with drama, but with signatures. Malcolm sat at the far table in a gray suit I hadn't seen since our 20th anniversary party. Back then, he'd worn it like armor. Today, it looked like it was wearing him. His attorney, a young man with the energy of a recently caffeinated hawk, flipped through notes with theatrical flair. He saw me and smiled, the kind of smile that thinks it's smarter than it is. Nina leaned over. "He's going to try character defamation. They think if they make you look fragile, the court will see you as unstable and unfit for asset management." I nodded. "Let them try." I brought annotated footnotes we were sworn in. Statements were made. Malcolm looked solemn, as though the weight of the world, or at least the mortgage, rested unfairly on his shoulders. Then his attorney stood. "Your Honor, we would like to raise concern regarding Ms. Calder's current cognitive reliability. We have reason to believe that her recollection of events, financial transactions, and household responsibilities is inconsistent." Ah, the old, "she must be confused" tactic. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and tilted my head, not unlike a hawk of my own, eyeing the difference between noise and threat. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense bob and reading glasses perched on her nose like punctuation, looked at me. "Ms. Calder, would you like to respond?" I stood, calm, steady, dressed in navy, hair pinned, pearl earrings, just enough to say competent, not desperate. "Your Honor," I began, "if forgetfulness were grounds for disqualification, my husband would have lost this marriage 25 years ago." A few eyebrows lifted. I continued. "I have kept detailed notes of every grocery run, every prescription refill, every specialist appointment booked and followed up. I have meal schedules dated from 2005, care instructions from when his mother stayed with us for 7 months, and logs of every doctor's visit and insurance call made on his behalf between 2011 and 2020. I reached into my folder and held up a color-coded chart. This is a year-by-year breakdown of unpaid labor performed inside that home, including medical advocacy, meal preparation, holiday event coordination, and elder care. For your reference, I've included estimated market rates next to each category." The opposing attorney opened his mouth. I didn't wait. "Furthermore," I added, "I am not confused. I am, however, finished pretending that 30 years of contribution only count when they align with his narrative." Malcolm shifted in his seat. For once, he had no line to deliver. The judge asked a few questions, director, professional. I answered each one without flinching. No dramatics, no tears, just facts. Facts he never expected me to collect, let alone present. When the gavel fell that afternoon, it didn't echo like a movie scene. It clicked. Small, efficient, final. The judge looked up and spoke without flourish. Based on the evidence presented and the long-term nature of this marital partnership, the court finds Ms. Calder eligible for financial restitution and legal entitlement under equitable distribution laws. She continued, Ms. Calder is awarded retroactive spousal contribution compensation, valued at a fair hourly rate consistent with in-home care and domestic management. She is entitled to 25% of the rental income generated by the main property transferred to Harper Hensley. Her pension and full health coverage remain intact and independent of any claims by Mr. Hensley. I didn't smile. Not yet. Nina squeezed my hand under the table. Her grip was firm, proud. Malcolm stared straight ahead, the color slowly draining from the space behind his carefully cultivated expression. For the first time he looked untethered, like a man discovering the consequences of underestimating a woman who alphabetized her own silence before breaking it. Outside, the breeze caught the hem of my coat as we stepped down the courthouse steps. It was late afternoon. The sun had that golden warmth, not triumphant, just earned. Nina turned to me. You were magnificent. No, I said. I was prepared. He built the stage, Nina. I just rewrote the monologue. She laughed. We crossed the street in silence. For the first time in 30 years, my name was on something official that mattered. Not a dinner place card, not a sympathy note for someone else's loss. A ruling, a record, a recognition. The cottage was smaller than I imagined. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a porch with chipped paint, and a view of the sea that made the wallpaper irrelevant. It sat at the end of a crooked lane near the edge of town, close enough to the community college to hear the faint sound of student debates on Tuesday mornings, but far enough that the only thing louder than the wind was my own breathing. Perfect. A real estate agent named Laurel had shown it to me 2 months earlier. She used words like quaint and charming, but what sold me wasn't the walkable layout or the overpriced hydrangeas blooming out front. It was the quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for explanations. The day I moved in, I unpacked exactly 4 boxes. One with kitchen essentials, one with my annotated anthologies, one with framed photos and inherited sarcasm, and one marked simply, E. Calder, future use. Henry settled into the corner armchair like he'd always been meant for it. I made tea in a chipped mug that didn't match the saucer. It felt like home in the same way truth feels after years of concession, startling, and slightly overdue. Within a week, I started volunteering. Nothing dramatic. No return to full-time teaching, no TED Talks, no memoir. Just a quiet hour each Wednesday at the Foster Youth Center near the college, where I hosted a reading group for girls between the ages of 9 and 16. They called it Lit Circle. I called it Strategic Resistance Disguised as Literacy. We read Baldwin Morrison, Audre Lorde, and yes, Jane Eyre. I taught them how to recognize when someone was writing over their story and how to press back, sentence by sentence. One girl, maybe 11, asked me why books mattered so much. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, because when no one listens to your voice, sometimes your words can outlive the silence. She didn't blink, just nodded and wrote it down. Smart girl. On the second Sunday after my move, I sat down with a glass of Merlot and updated my will. I made it simple. My books, every last one, from dog-eared penguin classics to leather-bound poetry editions, were to go to Imogene. Because anyone who draws dragons holding library cards deserves an arsenal. A portion of the court-awarded settlement was to be transferred in perpetuity to the Women's Access to Education Fund, a local nonprofit that gave scholarships to foster girls entering the humanities, because I knew too many brilliant minds that never made it to the classroom. As for Malcolm, nothing, not a letter, not a footnote, not even a post-it tucked in a book titled Regret. He kept the house. I kept my soul. A fair trade, if you ask me. When Sasha visited for the first time, she brought a pie, a crooked lampshade, and Imogene, who immediately demanded to see the library. I pointed to two tall bookshelves and one very determined stack on the floor. Imogene picked up a room of one's own and asked, "Is this about you?" I paused. "In a way," I said. "It's about every woman who finally stopped asking for permission to exist." She nodded. "Okay, I'll read it when I'm 9. I raised an eyebrow. "You're 8. I'm reading fast." Smart girl. That night after they left, I stood on the back porch watching the tide come in. No metaphor, just water meeting land. The stars overhead blinked like they knew something I didn't, and I let the wind slip through my fingers without needing to control where it went. This wasn't a reinvention. This was a return, not to who I was before Malcolm, but to who I always was beneath him. A woman who still believed in paper. A woman who folded silence into structure and called it literature. A woman who stopped waiting to be invited back into a house that never once asked what she needed to stay. I turned off the porch light, and for the first time in decades, I went to bed in a home that belonged to me, in every way that mattered. The knock was soft, almost polite, as if the person on the other side had remembered too late that they didn't live here anymore. I was setting out chairs for the Wednesday reading group when it happened. Paperback copies of The Second Sex fanned neatly across the table, the kettle just starting to sing in the kitchen. I opened the door without much anticipation. There he was, Malcolm Calder, former financier, full-time thundercloud, presently, a man unraveling at the seams. His coat was unbuttoned. His hair, once obsessively combed, had gone half gray and wholly rogue. He looked thinner, not from illness, but from disuse, like a man who hadn't had a reason to be important in months. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. I wasn't going to fill the silence. He always had an allergy to silence, thought it was a test to be passed. He cleared his throat. "I was in the neighborhood." That was unlikely. My cottage was 1 part oceanfront, 2 parts intentional exile. Still, I said nothing. He looked over my shoulder, noted the chairs, the books. "You're still teaching?" I raised a brow. "Retired, not fossilized." Malcolm gave a short, brittle laugh. "Right." A pause. Then, "I'm not here to fight, Evelyn. I just wanted to ask one thing." His voice was softer now, like he was borrowing someone else's remorse. "Aren't you even a little sorry?" There it was. The last trick of the trade. Guilt disguised as grace. He still wanted me to answer in a way that left him blameless. I tilted my head, considered the question as if it were a line in a book I'd once taught. "Of course I'm sorry," I said quietly. He looked surprised, hopeful even. I let it sit just long enough. Then I continued, "I'm sorry I stayed long enough for you to think I'd never leave." There was no venom in my voice, just precision, like a scalpel, or better yet, a footnote that dismantles an entire thesis. Malcolm's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked around as if realizing for the first time how small the porch was, how much space he no longer occupied in my life. "I miss things," he muttered. "I miss you." I offered a soft, non-committal nod. "People tend to miss libraries only after they're locked out." He blinked, as if the meaning took a moment longer than he liked. His hands fidgeted at his sides. He looked tired, not physically, but spiritually, like someone who finally understood the weight of being the center of his own orbit for too long. "Well," he said finally, "I should go." I didn't stop him, didn't reach for a jacket, or say something polite just to ease the goodbye. He turned, walked slowly down the path, each step marking an unlearning. At the end of the walkway, he paused, turned back. "You really seem fine," he said. I smiled gently. "That's because I am. No pageantry. No need to prove it." He nodded once, then turned the corner and disappeared. The kind of exit you don't slam a door on because some endings deserve quiet. I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. It didn't echo. I picked up a copy of The Second Sex from the table, thumbed through the preface, and made a small pencil underline beside a quote I knew would stir conversation later. "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Outside, I heard the sound of sneakers on gravel. The girls had started to arrive. Backpacks slung over shoulders, paperbacks peeking from under sweaters. One of them shouted from the gate, "Aunt Evie, do we have to read all of it?" "Just enough," I replied, "to become dangerous." They laughed. Someone handed me a peach from their lunchbox. Someone else asked if we could sit on the porch today. We could. We did. I didn't look back down the street. There was nothing there that needed remembering. Only forward now, into the pages we choose to write ourselves. And in the calm of that early evening, with voices rising and the tide humming in the distance, I opened the book and began. Let's start with why she wrote it. And maybe by the end,